of the situation with Trump. It's a kind of an interesting personal story that of CQ. That just yeah, it's kind of interesting. I mean, obviously, I'm not a huge fan of the military, but a guy like him, even though he probably has beliefs I disagree with, there just seems to be a basic integrity.
Well, that's his first mistake. Can't have integrity if you're in the Trump administration.
Smedley Butler, the American soldier all the way. The real deal.
Indeed. Well, let me get started here and then so I can finish. Welcome to the live stream is going. 27 February, dis and dat. As I mentioned yesterday, we're going to sort of finish up the last chapter or so of a book that essentially is the expanded version of his dissertation, Desmond McNeil's Fetishism and the Theory of Value, Reassessing Marx in the 21st Century, published in 2021. Anyway, we're going to talk a little bit about environment today. Some main questions, of course, to consider is how is it possible to secure and even deepen democracy under a war economy? How can social and individual freedom flourish despite the obvious necessity to strictly follow social and ecological planning? And what would prosperity and development mean in life after capitalism? Those are Kohei Saito's questions that he's raised with his books on the Anthropocene. But before we get there, I'm going to finish off Desmond McNeil's book. Desmond McNeil teaches at the University of Oslo as an emeritus. So, Marx and the Environment, chapter 14. One part of society thus exacts tribute from another for the permission to inhabit the earth as landed property, in general, assigns the landlord the privilege of exploiting the terrestrial body, the bowels of the earth, the air, and thereby the maintenance and development of life. The aim of this book has been to study Marx's theory of value and especially his concept of fetishism and assess the relevance of these ideas today. In this concluding section, I bring this work up to date by reviewing more recent literature. I will begin, however, by briefly summarizing my findings. I have argued that the qualitative aspect of the theory of value is a crucial part of Marx's contribution to economics, which has not been given due attention. It finds expression in his analysis of the value form and fetishism. These provide the starting point of his logico-historical analysis of the capitalist system and his critique of economic categories. Marxian economists have not, I suggest, made sufficient efforts to study and develop this aspect of his work. There has been a tendency to regard the qualitative theory of value as falling outside the domain of economics proper. Brilliant, perhaps, to be classified as the work of Marx the sociologist or Marx the philosopher. I have argued, however, that they occupy a central place in his analysis of capitalism and bourgeois economics. In Part 1, Chapters 2, 3, and 4, I traced how Marx uses the term fetishism in his writings from almost his first published work as a journalist to the first volume of Capital, and how its significance developed from a mere rhetorical device to an analytical tool of central importance to his critique of political economy, the concept of commodity fetishism. In Part 2, Chapters 5, 6, and 7, I examined how he extends the concept from the commodity to money, capital, and interest-bearing capital, and how, in theorizing exchange value in Capital Volume 1, he walks a narrow path between the bourgeois economics of Samuel Bailey and the mystification of Hegel. Throughout these chapters, I was concerned with the question, what is the ontological status of value? What is it that renders something valuable, transmuting it from an object, physical object, to a commodity? And here the concept of the fetish is a useful analogy. for a fetish is, in a sense, real. It has real effects, not because of its material, but its social qualities, the shared beliefs and practices of society. This is Marx's strength by comparison with bourgeois economics. He recognizes and seeks to come to grips with the social aspect of capitalism and the implications for relations of power. In parts 3 and 4, I discussed what I regard as some shortcomings in his work. In chapters 8, 9, and 10, I noted that all the various analogies that Marx uses for explaining exchange value are physical, material, and argued that comparison with language would have been more enlightening. The aptness of this analogy rests precisely on the fact that language is the epitome of the social. This is largely why approaches which have developed from the study of language, structuralism, and semiotics, have proved enlightening in some of the social sciences, but they have not proved so successful in economics. Structural Marxism could, I suggested, have successfully built on such an approach, but failed to do so. In part 4, chapters 11, 12, and 13, I showed that Marx's conception of the social is primarily, if not exclusively, with labor and production, and that this causes him to ignore the fact that exchange and consumption also are social phenomena. My purpose in this final section is to assess the relevance of fetishism and the theory of value for contemporary capitalism by reviewing some of the Marx-inspired literature of recent decades. I limit myself to two areas of work: the environment and financialization. These topics account for the greater part of the literature, not surprising in view of the financial crisis of 2008 and the escalating crisis of climate change and other environmental challenges. I will first very briefly summarize the significance of the term fetishism as an analytical tool. Note 2, in Capital, Volume 1, Marx begins with exchange value and the commodity which constitute the very foundations of the capitalist system. Exchange value is the form that value takes, a form which conceals its origins in labor. As Marx expresses it, in exchange value, a social relation between persons assumes the fantastic form of a relation between things. This is the phenomenon that he refers to as the fetishism of commodities. Note 3, this is a very apt metaphor for the power of the fetish among the people of West Africa, whence the term arose, did not derive from its natural material properties, but from the beliefs and practices of that society, hence the resemblance to ideology. So too in capitalism. What appears to be natural, the market price of a commodity, is very far from being so. It is, in fact, social. Social in the sense that it is dependent on the shared beliefs and practices of society. See eggs. The fetishism of commodities allows the exploitation of labor to be concealed. The fact that surplus value accrues to the capitalist as profit appears natural, unchallenged. In reviewing the recent literature, my interest has been in two questions. To what extent do these works on the environment and financialization draw on Marx's theory of value and his concept of fetishism? And conversely, is our understanding of Marx's theory of value and his concept of fetishism enhanced by these works? With regard to the two topics, environment and financialization, Marx's analysis of the sources of revenue is of particular relevance. This is summed up in the famous Trinity formula, to which I will make frequent reference. Capital, that is profit of enterprise plus interest; land, that is ground rent; labor, that is wages. This is the Trinity formula, which comprises all the secrets of the social production process. Here, Marx includes in his analysis not only capital and labor, but also land in the broad sense to include mines, forests, etc. While capitalists receive profits, landowners receive rent, and workers receive wages. This appears to be natural. But this is far from the case. The secrets are hidden by the mystifying way in which the relations are presented. In recent years, a great deal has been written about nature and the environment that draws on Marx's work. Most of this is to be found not in economics, but rather in geography or interdisciplinary studies such as political ecology and critical agrarian studies. What these works generally share is a recognition that capital's relation to nature has both widened and deepened dramatically. It has widened in geographical terms. Under capitalism, the appropriation of nature and its transformation into means of production occur for the first time at a world scale. Um, Note 4, and it is deepened in terms of extending property rights over a larger range of goods and services, production, all the way down to the level of molecular biology and DNA sequencing. This extension of the phenomenon with regard to the environment may also combine with financialization, as in the case of carbon emissions trading, which, according to some, could overtake oil as the world's biggest commodity market and could become the world's biggest market overall. In this Marxist-inspired literature, there's a broad consensus in rejecting market-based environmental policies such as emissions trading. But there are also major disagreements, largely between what are sometimes referred to as Reds and Greens, either applauding or criticizing Marx's writings on nature. It is notable, however, that while these writers often quote Marx, the majority make little or no reference to his labor theory of value. Value is central to the political economy of capitalism, but Marxian value theory has generally been abandoned when it comes to including nature in the analysis. The Marxist tradition makes occasional reference to a law of value, but this law can scarcely be detected in most radical analyses of capitalism, its historical movements, and its relation to the web of life. Greens, even Marxist Greens, tend to avoid the question of value in some ways, but embrace it in others. To cite Christopher's, recent years have seen forceful calls for political ecologists and other scholars concerned with the political economy of the environment to engage more actively with value theory in general and Marxian value theory in particular, claiming that a generation of such scholars has generally avoided constructive engagement with value theory. Robertson and Wainwright argue that it is high time that this neglect is put right. Several scholars have attempted the task of summarizing Marx's views of nature. Useful overviews of this literature are to be found in Castry and Dolnick, on which I mainly draw in the following brief review of Marxian writing related to the environment. According to de Castry, it is difficult to distill a coherent Marxist position on the question of nature, despite, or perhaps because of, the fact that Marxists have spent more than a century mining his texts in order to piece together otherwise disparate and often nomic contents and asides on capitalism and nature. Smith puts it, quote, "The discussion of capital was not intended to analyze nature specifically under capitalism. Pursuing his primary task did not require him to be present or even develop a completed conception of nature." Apart from Engels himself, Alfred Schmidt, Sebastiano Temperano, and Norman Garros were early contributors to the debate. In summarizing their works, I will refer mainly to some few who appear to dominate the field. Writing on the topic increased rapidly with a growing international interest in the environment that generally dated back to the first Earth Summit in Stockholm in 1972 and the largely influential Limits to Growth text. An important landmark was the journal Capitalism, Nature, and Socialism, initiated in 1988 by James O'Connor. Much of the literature may be described as eco-Marxist, defined by Castry as a growing corpus of work largely fashioned in the last decade, which seeks to read Marx as an actual or potential critic of capitalism's environmental consequences. He names Elmar Altvater, Rainer Grundmann, and James O'Connor as examples of scholars in this tradition. The growth of eco-Marxism parallels and counters the evolving capitalist response to the problem, summarized by Baker as follows. First, a new intense phase of privatization and accumulation by dispossession began. Its most recent, well-publicized iteration is a series of land grabs and water grabs by globalized corporations. Second, ecological fixes, moving polluting industries to developing countries. Third, framing environmental externalities as opportunities for profit. For it is not necessary to scour nature's entire collective works in order to isolate its different treatments of nature. This painstaking and ambitious project has already been completed by Alfred Schmidt in his difficult but definitive study of the concept of nature in Marx. Turning waste into, let's see, the third, blah, blah, blah. Third, for example, turning waste into a resource. Fourth, attempting to commodify new types of socio-natures from the global climate to genes. Although sharing an antipathy towards capitalism, the so-called red-green alliance was not always a comfortable one. Some writers criticized Marx for either ignoring nature or adopting a Promethean attitude committed to industrial progress, irrespective of natural limits. While some argued that his work was fully compatible with ecological thinking, others sought to reinterpret and adapt his writings to develop a new synthesis. Anthony Giddens, Sir Anthony Giddens, is generally identified as the one who characterized Marx's thinking as Promethean. Foster identifies a number of other writers who held the same view: Ted Benton, Kate Soper, Robin Exley, Murray Bookchin, and David Goldblatt. Against these, he poses Elmar Altvater, Paul Burkett, Michael Perelman, the late Michael Perelman, Michael Leibowitz, David Harvey, and himself, Dolinek. Dolinek distinguishes between a first stage of eco-socialist writings in the 1970s, which was critical of and distant towards Marxism, from a second stage from the 1990s onward, which fleshed out a more comprehensive Marxist analysis of nature and sought a synthesis of red and green ideas. Examples of these are Benson's edited volume, The Greening of Marxism, Burkett's Marx and Nature, a Red and Green Perspective, and Foster's, that is Bellamy Foster's, Marx's Ecology. These volumes testified to the growing recognition that Marx's political economy represented a valuable framework for dealing with the present ecological crisis. Since then, 2 decades of scholarship have accumulated arguing that Marx and Engels embedded ecological thinking deep within their critique of capitalism. The claim that Marx's attitude to nature was Promethean can find support in some quotations from his work, but be readily countered by others. A detailed analysis by Smith argues convincingly against the charge. It's not Marx that's the villain. Contrary to many who accuse Marx of ignoring the value of nature, his theory suggests that it is capitalism. A more complex question, and one which dominates much of the debate, concerns the relationship that people have to nature. Here, scholars use a number of interrelated terms: first nature or second nature, internal nature or external nature, the production of nature, the construction of nature, the metabolic rift. These terms, all to varying extents, involve binaries, and the debates about them are supplemented by a sometimes vituperative meta-debate about Cartesian dualism that I will not include in my account, thank goodness. To limit the scope of my review, I also exclude related debates about space, a topic of interest especially to Marxist geographers. The terms first and second nature derive from Schmidt, reintroduced and reworked from Hegel. This distinguishes nature at its most elemental from nature as transformed by society. The term production of nature derives from Smith. Expressed in simple terms, it refers to the fact that pristine nature no longer exists, if indeed it ever did. Nature has been hugely transformed by human beings, this is the Anthropocene argument, and more specifically and dramatically in recent centuries by capitalism, hence the suggestion that the term Anthropocene might be better replaced by Capitalocene. A related issue is the construction of nature as an idea, a social category. Confusingly, the term is used by some to refer to construction in the material sense. But as Smith emphasizes, while the production of nature thesis certainly stresses the veins of social agency that run through nature, it is not in any way assimilable to or to be confused with the constructionist paradigm that has become fashionable since the 1980s. Castry identifies a persistent polarity between naturalistic and social constructionist views. Although Malm asserts that no one seriously and consistently occupies either of the two polarized positions regarding the issue, that nature is entirely produced literally by humans, or that it exists only as an idea, he includes quotations from Latour and Haraway, Bruno Latour and Donna Haraway, that seem close to the latter extreme. Let's see. Note 6, according to Smith, Marx does not make much reference to space except in relation to use value. He quotes Marx concerning the transportation of people or commodities, wherein a material change is affected in the object of labor, spatial change, change of place. Along with this goes a change in its use value. Its exchange value increases in the same measure this change in value requires labor. Other authors who have written on space from a Marxist perspective include Lefebvre, Castells, and Harvey. Footnote 7. For example, Haraway, nature is a powerful discursive construction. It is a trope. It is a figure, construction, artifact, movement, displacement. Nature cannot pre-exist its construction. That's a very interesting way of thinking about it. Anyway, back to the text. The term metabolic rift was coined by Marx. He wrote of a rift between town and country, and in a passage which clearly demonstrates his appreciation of the capitalist threat to sustainable agriculture, he notes that it disturbs the metabolic interaction between man and the earth. It hinders the operation of the eternal natural condition for the lasting fertility of the soil. The term was taken up by Schmidt and recently extended by other scholars, most notably, John Bellamy Foster. According to Malm, the metabolic rift school has come under sustained fire from Jason Moore. Jason Moore believes more of a sort of web of life approach as opposed to metabolic rift. And of course, they attack each other for a variety of things. Moore accuses Bellamy Foster of some kind of Kantian dualism and blah, blah, blah. He seeks to demonstrate that Foster and colleagues repeat the original sin of Cartesian dualism. In the substantial body of literature that I've attempted to summarize, only few scholars relate their work to Marx's theory of value. Those that do discuss it and recognize its central place in his work usually seek to adapt it either by complementing it with a parallel theory or expanding it to include things other than labor. I will now briefly describe these alternatives. Theories of value. Many of those whose work I've reviewed use words such as production and work, although seldom labor, which confuses the debate since this would seem to imply a link with Marx's theory of value. Or they adopt new terms such as abstract social nature. But they often display an equivocal relationship to the labor theory of value if they engage with it at all. O'Connor is the best example of one who sought to supplement Marxist theory of value with another. He posits a second contradiction of capitalism relating not to the production of surplus value, but to global environmental destruction. In O'Connor's book of 1998, he proposed that the capital-nature relation was no less fundamental than the capital-labor relation the capital-nature relation was no less fundamental than the capital-labor relation in analyzing how capitalism reproduces and ultimately undermines itself. In his journal, Capitalism, Nature, Socialism, in which he sought to expand value to include the contribution from nature, O'Connor's purpose was to combine the works of Marx and Polanyi, including the latter's concept of fictitious commodities. This involved a massive review of the labor theory of value. The other alternative to propose an extended theory of value is based on the premise that the labor theory of value fails to take account of the contribution made by nature. Moore is one of the most well-known in this tradition, seeking, quote, a productive synthesis of Marxist and green thinking. Value relations incorporate a double movement to exploitation and appropriation. Within the commodity system, the exploitation of labor power reigns supreme, but this supremacy is only possible given its tendency towards self-exhaustion to the degree that the appropriation of uncommodified natures counteracts this tendency. Now, this has been difficult to discern because value relations are necessarily much broader than in the immediate production of commodities. The centrality of wage work in certain Marxist perspective is not wrong, but partial, given the unsustainability of the circuit of capital as a closed system. He argues that capitalism can be comprehended through the shifting configuration of the exploitation of labor power and the appropriation of cheap nature. This proposal is indeed radical. Quote, Marxists have taken value to be an economic phenomenon with systemic implications. This, I think, inverts the reality. Value relations are a systemic phenomenon with a pivotal economic moment. The law of value, Moore argues, far from reducible to abstract social labor, finds its necessary conditions of self-expansion through the creation and subsequent appropriation of cheap natures. This he lists as labor, food, energy, and raw materials, the four cheaps, so to speak. This was subsequently, in a book with Raj Patel, extended to 7 cheaps. Moore's work has been sharply criticized, for example, by Nyeri, but others share his views. A blind spot in the labor theory of value is its treatment of the unpaid work of animals, fuel, household workers, workers in the informal sector, or forced labor. The work of resources, for example, is categorized as rent accruing to the owners of land. Collis, who promotes the idea of degrowth, suggests to extend the term exploitation beyond class-based appropriation to include other forms of undue transfers based on race, gender, or ethnicity, including the unpaid appropriation of resources and the services of ecosystems. Sometimes based on the work of Georgescu Rogan, attempts have also been made to develop an energy-based theory of value, which have been hotly debated. I introduced some of those ideas a while back. The key issue in the debates reviewed in the foregoing pages is whether Marx's theory can and should be extended, reinterpreted, updated to better incorporate the role of nature. One way to address this issue is in the form of a question. Is nature productive? Two contrasting positions regarding the issue are well expressed in, quote, Do Bees Produce Value? A conversation between an ecological economist and a Marxist geographer. The problem is, as Collis rightly states in seeking to clarify the debate, quote, much of the misapprehension between ecological and Marxist economists has to do with the fact that terms such as value do not have the same meaning for us ecological economists. Well, yes and no. The motivation for many eco-Marxists in promoting a revised theory of value is to seek a way of countering the damage that capitalism is imposing on the environment. Marx's solution is a higher economic, wait a second, 12, that's subnote 12. Footnote 11, there's been even proposed an animal labor theory of value as noted by Foster and Burkett. Footnote 12. Let's see. It is clear that Marx was aware of the threat that capitalism posed for the environment. His analysis helps to explain its endless striving for profit and hence increased production, but one aspect that he fails to examine is the drive to ever-increasing consumption, which is the necessary corollary to production, Department 1, Department 2. Some Marxist economists have addressed the issue, and most notably Ben Fine, who has developed a theory of consumption inspired by Marx's work that demonstrates the power that producers exert over consumers. But a form of society in which private property is abolished that's indicated in the following passage, which concludes with a very apt expression of the modern concept of sustainability. Private ownership of the globe by single individuals will appear quite as absurd as private ownership of one man by another. Even a whole society, a nation, or even all simultaneously existing societies taken together are not the owners of the globe. They are only its possessors, its usufructuaries usufructuaries, yes. And like Bonaparte's familias, they was handed down to succeeding generations in an improved condition. Accumulation by dispossession. David Harvey has been an important scholar in bringing the works of Marx to a wider audience, not only within his own discipline, geography, most notably through his clear and rigorous account of Marx's work in Limits to Capital. To a greater extent than most of those referred to above, Harvey does relate his analysis to Marx's theory of value. In recent years, he's been particularly influential owing to his writing on accumulation by dispossession. This helps with the settler colonial debates, etc. This expression, coined by Giovanni Aguirre, replaced the former term continuous primitive accumulation. Primitive original accumulation is the historical process of divorcing the producer from the means of production and subsistence. The argument for preferring the new term, accumulation by dispossession, was that the word primitive is misleading. It's always misleading. The phenomenon is still very much a reality in the poor countries of the world. The so-called land grabs throughout Africa, Latin America, and much of Asia are just the most obvious symptom of a politics of accumulation by dispossession run riot in ways that even Polanyi could not have imagined. Indeed, as Harvey argues, the concept is also applicable to what is happening today in rich countries, even if it is less apparent and manifested less brutally. This cannot be the whole picture, but this cannot be the whole picture. A fuller understanding of this very social phenomenon is required if the environmental challenges to be effectively confronted. According to Robert Brenner, Harvey has done an impressive job of reviving Marx's primitive accumulation, adapting it for the present day, and demonstrating its value in understanding not only contemporary capitalism, but also contemporary neoliberal imperialism. The term has certainly been taken up widely. Part of the attraction of the concept accumulation by dispossession is that it relates so directly to politically urgent issues, such as land grabs in poor countries. Some of its most vicious and inhumane manifestations are in the most vulnerable and degraded regions within uneven geographical development. But it appeals also, no doubt, because of the rhetorical power of the words themselves. This may, however, come at a cost, at least according to one of its critics, Das, who describes it as a chaotic concept and argues that Harvey inflates the causal significance of the concept far too much. Das acknowledges the validity of Harvey's point that Marx mistakenly relegates accumulation based on predation, fraud, and violence to an original stage that is considered no longer relevant. And that's an important point, considering that, predation still exists at a very high level. But he notes that Harvey, at his own admission, inflates the idea somewhat and worries about the indiscriminate way in which it might be and already has been used. A number of authors have applied the concept in an analysis of land grabbing, or its more specific variant, green grabbing, where green credentials are called upon to justify appropriations of land for food or fuel. This is an increasingly urgent topic to study and critically analyze. The ever-expanding global reach of private property and the varying, often extra-economic means by which this is exercised, and not least the role of the state in this process. Then there are footnotes 13, 14, and 15. Nature as accumulation strategy. Many recent articles relate to ways in which nature is being commodified and financialized by, for example, carbon markets. Robert Costanzo, one of the most influential advocates of placing a money value on the environment, argues that the Earth is a very efficient, least cost provider of human life support services, the entire value of which is between $16 and $54 trillion. This, as Robertson notes, is more than the then current global GNP. As Swinga notes, the commodification of CO2, primarily via the Kyoto Protocol and various offsetting schemes, in turn, has triggered a rapidly growing derivatives market of futures and options. In his article, Nature as Accumulation Strategy, Smith identifies a number of such ecological commodities, as he calls them. On the same theme, Bram Busher and Robert Fletcher proposed the term accumulation by conservation, whereby public, private, and non-governmental sectors seek ways to turn the non-material use of nature into capital that can simultaneously save the environment and establish long-term modes of capital accumulation. They list various examples: carbon markets, ecotourism, species and wetlands banking, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. In addition, derivatives of all of the above and more extend markets still further. As Robertson describes it, imposing market relations on uncapitalized environmental phenomena requires techniques by which a dollar value can be placed on environmental services, and such techniques have proliferated over the past decade on the strength of the imagined consensus on the need to price nature. One of the most important such techniques is, of course, cost-benefit analysis. He adds, the extraordinary complexity of state and regulatory procedures forcing the commodification of CO2 exemplifies par excellence what Marx once defined as commodity fetishism. This, I suggest, is a rather inaccurate interpretation of the concept, which has been used to place money value not only on nature, but also human life and future generations. The phenomenon of payment for environmental services may be seen as reflecting the latest move down a slippery conceptual slope, or perhaps more accurately, a broken ladder that leads irresistibly from nature to the environment, a more scientific term, from the environment to environmental services, a still more technical term, and finally to payment for environmental services, the incorporation of nature into the world of economics and of finance, as discussed in the following chapter. Payment for environmental services, and more broadly, the commodification of nature, is critiqued in an article by Coso and Cabrera, which is of particular interest for my review since it explores the issue through the lens of commodity fetishism, understood here as the masking of the social relationships underlying the process of production. They identify three inherent invisibilities in the commodification of ecosystem services: simplifying the complexity of natural ecosystems, prioritizing a single exchange value that denies the multiplicity of values which can be attributed to these services, and masking the social relations, that is, the power asymmetries embedded in the process of producing and selling ecosystem services. Although the article claims that it draws inspiration from the concept of commodity fetishism, I would argue that only the third of these invisibilities is directly comparable with the term as Marx employed it. As long ago as 1990, David Harvey urged geographers to deploy the Marxian concept of fetishism with its full force. Few have taken up his challenge. Noel Castry has invoked the term in several articles, though he is seemingly skeptical of all Marx's huff and puff about metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties, and the way that many Marxists since Marx have arguably confined it in an epistemic straitjacket. But understanding the phenomenon of commodity fetishism can, he argues, help to make visible the geographical lives of commodities. As Harvey expressed it, the grapes that sit upon supermarket shelves are mute. We cannot see the fingerprints of exploitation upon them or tell immediately what part of the world they're from. Castry uses the example of bioprospecting to ask the question, where more generally do public or common resources and knowledges begin, and where do they end? The kind of difficult question a contemporary Marxist critique of the commodity fetish allows us to ask. Like Harvey in his original article from 1990, Castry and others to whom he refers are concerned to highlight the displacements, geographical, temporal, and phenomenal, that are part and parcel of capitalist commodification, and hence reveal the exploitation of the system. Noel Castry states, however, that for a number of reasons, most contemporary social, cultural, and economic geographers prefer metaphors other than fetishism in the pursuit of commodity analysis. Using terms such as commodity displacement, the social geography of things, commodity chains, and actor networks, He refers to the work of Hartwig, whose analysis focuses not only on the concealed exploitation of labor, but also of nature, adding a comment which I suggest somewhat misrepresents the concept of commodity fetishism. Hartwig's point, like Marx's, is that the spatio-temporal separation of commodity producers and commodity consumers in capitalism means that the latter cannot see what is contained in the physical form of the commodities they purchase. Marx on rent. While the writings referred to above do draw inspiration from Marx, they in many cases make little or no reference to what was surely central to Marx's analysis of nature under capitalism, namely his theory of rent, as Christophers has noted. Consider, meanwhile, that the fate of the one substantial strand of conceptual political economy that does emphasize land. Christophers, like Castro, has been inspired by Harvey and suggests to apply the critique of commodity fetishism to the circulation of money in a way that should look broadly like the attempts that have been made to follow non-monetary commodities and hence to trace their socio-spatial backgrounds. Footnote 18, adopting a similar approach, Michael Hudson suggests that the alternative trade movement represents an initial attempt to counter the pervasiveness of commodity fetishism, working to make visible and relevant the social relations that underlie production and exchange. Given a fillip by Harvey's exposition and limits of capital, such theory enjoyed a brief period in the spotlight in the 1980s before essentially disappearing off the radar, circumscribed gesturing at rent gaps. This is surprising since, however one may interpret Marx's writings on nature, it is clear that the concept of rent occupies a central position. Harvey asserted that rent has to be brought forward into the forefront of the analysis. Perhaps this is now beginning to happen. According to Andreucci et al., the rent question is returning with a vengeance. In the totality of his works, Marx's writing on rent is relatively brief. It is set out in most detail in Capital Volume 3, and to a lesser extent, Theories of Surplus Value Volume 3. As many commentators have noted, the exposition is rather repetitive and sometimes hard to follow. Appallingly muddled, to quote Harvey. Engels, who composed both of the above works after Marx's death, writes in the preface to Capital Volume 2, in the case of the third volume, there's nothing to go by outside a first extremely incomplete draft. He does, however, add, the part on ground rent was much more fully treated than Part 5, although by no means properly arranged. In what follows, I will present a brief review of Marx on rent, starting with the famous Trinity formula, capital, profit, ground, rent, labor, wages. This is the Trinity formula, which comprises all the secrets of the social production process. This formula constitutes a highly condensed summary of Marx's key argument. It brings together two triads, the three classes, that is, capital, labor, and landowners, and their respective returns under capitalism. Presented in this way, the relations capital-profit and labor-wages are fetishized, appearing as if they were natural. The exploitative nature of the relation between capital and labor is thus concealed. This is the main focus of Marx's analysis, how capitalists exploit workers, cheating them out of the surplus value that they create. Now, but what of the relations between capitalists and landowners, and between landowners and workers? Are these also antagonistic? How do they appear in the mystical world of capitalism and bourgeois political economy? In his writing, Marx concentrates primarily on the capital-labor relationship and the two fetishized relations, that is, capital-profit and labor-wages. But Marx's theory of rent includes also the relationship between capitalists and landowners. This is accorded relatively limited attention to the relation between landowners and workers, even less. But to analyze capitalism and the environment, it is in fact these relations that are of the most relevance. In brief, Marx's analysis is that the landowner appropriates a part of the surplus value from the capitalist. By contrast, in Marx's theory, the landowner and the worker have no direct relationship. This is because he's analyzing the situation in fully blown capitalism where people are already removed from the land. The relationship between landowner and worker is treated as a historical one in which the former appropriated land from the latter. But in pre-capitalism, of course, the relationship is direct and important. The landowner exerts power over the worker, for example, as slave or serf. As Coronil forcefully pointed out, this phenomenon is very much ongoing in many countries still, which is why the debate about accumulation by dispossession is important. As noted above, if land is much more broadly defined to include, for example, genes, the phenomenon is still relevant in many advanced countries. Marx's theory of rent shows how it developed historically with the expansion of capitalism. As labor was removed from the land under the influence of capital, a new triangular relationship was developed between capital, land, and labor. As he notes, the categories rent and labor, unlike capital, existed also before capitalism. Marx shows how the property owner, thanks to ownership of the land, is able to divert some of the surplus value generated in production to his own pocket. But what of the process whereby the landowner exerts exclusive property rights over the land? Although he does rail against the institution of private property and devotes space to describing its historical development, Marx does not theorize much about it. Perhaps for this reason, an important distinction has sometimes been blurred between two organically related but analytically distinct moments. That is, the creation of property rights and the struggle over the appropriation and distribution of the land on the one hand and labor on the other, two elements of the real labor process, which in this material form are common to all modes of production, which are the material elements of every process of production and have nothing to do with its social form. Scholars have used different words to relate to these, that is, expropriation, exploitation, and both, and so on. To avoid confusion, I shall use the term appropriation, distinguishing between two distinct phenomena: appropriation 1, the extraction of rent, and appropriation 2, the institution of private property. I believe that some of the confusion regarding the concept of accumulation by dispossession is that this term actually conflates the two. Appropriation 1. This capitalist farmer pays the landowner, the owner of the land exploited by him, a sum of money for the right to invest his capital in this specific sphere of production. This sum of money is called ground rent, no matter whether it is paid for agricultural land, building lots, mines, fishing grounds, or forests. Appropriation 1 enables the landowner to appropriate a part of the surplus value that accrues in the production process. Wherever natural forces can be monopolized and guarantee a surplus profit to the industrial capitalist using them, be it waterfalls, rich mines, waters teeming with fish, or a favorably located building site, there the person who by virtue of title to a portion of the globe has become the proprietor of these natural objects will wrest this surplus profit from functioning capital in the form of rent. Marx appears to be even more critical of the landowner than the capitalist. He describes the former as a class that neither works itself, nor directly exploits labor, nor can find morally edifying rationalizations as in the case of interest-bearing capital, for example, risk and sacrifice of lending capital to others. While ground rent is that which is paid simply for the use of the land, the situation is complicated by the fact that capitalists typically will invest in the land. Capital may be fixed in the land, incorporated in it either in a transitory manner, as though improvements of a chemical nature, fertilization, etc., or more permanently, as in drainage canals, irrigation works, leveling farm buildings, etc. Marx refers to these payments for improvements as differential rent 1 and 2. We've looked at that before. Such differential rent does not constitute the actual ground rent, which is paid for the use of the land as such, be it in a natural or cultivated state. Marx makes a further distinction by identifying absolute rent as that which is attributable to some resource being the subject of monopoly. For example, champagne. That is champagne. Only sparkling wine from Champagne can be called champagne. Everything else is sparkling wine, for example. As Marx notes, there is a certain symmetry between this phenomenon and the exploitation of labor. Just as the operating capitalist pumps surplus labor and thereby surplus value and surplus product in the form of profit out of the laborer, so the landlord, in turn, pumps a portion of this surplus value or surplus product out of the capitalist in the form of rent, in accordance with the laws already elaborated. According to Joan Robinson, Ricardo made the same point in taking pains to show that the landlords were parasites on society. He was, to some extent, the champion of the capitalists. They were part of the productive forces against the parasites. He was pro-capitalist as against the landlords more than he was pro-worker against the capitalists. Some of the Marxist literature concerns rather technical issues relating to varying forms of differential rent and sometimes also absolute rent. These debates, as indeed many of the others discussed in this chapter, are complicated by the uneasy fit between conceptual categories and empirical reality. Even the former are clear-cut, even if the former are clear-cut, which is not always the case. It is often difficult to apply them in an unequivocal way to the world as it is, especially when the categories were developed 150 years ago. An extreme example of this is the category land itself. How is this to be understood? In his discussion of rent, Marx usually talks about agriculture, but notes that the same argument also applies to other natural resources. For example, he writes, it should be noted for the sake of completeness that we shall also include water in the term land, insofar as it belongs to someone, as an accessory to the land. The sum of money is also called ground rent, no matter whether it's paid for agricultural land, building lots, mines, fishing grounds, or forests. Or instead of agriculture, we can use mining because the laws are the same for both. Appropriation 2. By appropriation 2, I refer to the establishment of exclusive private property over land, broadly defined as the monopoly by certain persons over definite portions of the globe as exclusive spheres of their private will to the exclusion of all others. Now, this is referred to by Marx as legal fiction. As he notes, free private ownership of land is a very recent product. In England, a crucial example was the communal lands turned successively into private property through the enclosure bills, thanks to the opportunity which makes the thief the more or less plausible legalistic subterfuges of the big landlords to justify their appropriation. This led to the removal of workers from the land and their reappearance as capitalist wage labor. The monstrous power wielded by landed property when united hand in hand with industrial capital enables it to be used against laborers engaged in their wage struggle as a means of practically expelling them from the earth as a dwelling place. One part of society thus extracts tribute from another for the permission to inhabit the earth, as landed property in general assigns the landlord the privilege of exploiting the terrestrial body, the bowels of the earth, the air, and thereby the maintenance and development of life. And there are footnotes 22 and 23. I like this phrase, the legal fiction by grace of which certain individuals have an exclusive right to certain parts of our planet. Anyway. The main way in which Marx's theory of value connects with nature is through the concept of rent. This topic, too, is apparently also back on the agenda now. The rent question is returning with a vengeance. As I've argued, Marx's theory of rent, although somewhat incoherent, does indeed have continuing relevance. I focus especially on how it relates to the qualitative theory of value, his analysis of the mysterious and mystifying fetishistic inner workings of capitalism. In this respect, it concerns mainly the relationship between capitalists and landowners. And then the ending, according to Christopher's, the political economists of nature, have increasingly recognized the salience of financial institutions, practices, and devices, but with notable exceptions, the literature has skirted or merely fluttered its eyelashes at value and value theory, at least in a Marxian guise. Meanwhile, those staging the human environment tradition's fresh encounter with value theory have thus far had very little of substance to say about finance. It is in this direction that I now turn. Um, and we're not going to cover that, or we might do some of that tomorrow. I've exceeded my time. Let me get back to the my original commentary here, I hope. And I assume the live stream was continuing. Are there any comments? Usufruct, yes. The Grundrisse. Oh, Joe is late. Fertilizing the land. Yes, capitalists are landowners often. There's this can be dealt with in terms of differential rent in the sense that it depends on who is applying improvements to the land and what type those improvements are, and the temporal and spatial differences in which you add those improvements. Because there are some people who are landowners who, for example, they live on the damn land, or they're absent from it, and that's kind of a distinction. And then there's another way to think of it as a distinction in terms of the quality of uh, types of capital improvement. That is a capital improvement that might relate more to the land itself, the chemistry, or to the infrastructure. That is, whether it's irrigation versus buildings, for example. I think you can make those kinds of differentiations. Dave, you have a question?
Yeah, hi, am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're talking about financialization of property and stuff. Um,
Well, that's
I
sort of
was
the
thinking,
chapter afterwards, but carry on.
this has been ever since the drill baby drill, right?
Yes.
And I was thinking, we're putting out a ton of oil already.
Yes.
And my experience being here in Frackland, Pennsylvania, of course, is
Yes.
that once the price goes down, they don't drill. They just sit
Yes.
on the leases. So are they just looking to lock up leases as financialization instruments that they can do
Yes.
derivatives from? They're not going to drill and lower the price, because as soon as the price goes down, they're going to stop drilling. That's how
Yes.
they operate. Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. That's the
That's
general
my question.
model,
Yeah.
irregardless of whether it's fracking or not fracking. It's the same model, right?
Right. It's how the oil industry works.
Right.
Yeah.
It's
They're not going to
just
bring the price down. They need the price at a
no.
sweet spot, and they have all the reserves to control that sweet spot.
Right. But the
One way or
advantage,
the other. Yeah.
the technical advantage of fracking, of course, is that you can sort of push the envelope, right? That's the whole point.
Oh yeah, there's gas that's been sitting under us and land that's been leased for $2 an acre for decades before the boom back in '08 or whenever that was, '09, the lease boom then.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's no different the world around. It's what the Arabs do, whatever.
hmm hmm
The-
Yeah, it's just locking up those reserves, for those future taps, but also to financialize now, right? Yeah.
right. But then you pair
Yeah.
that against the advantages they get from leasing and from the acquisition of leasing and exploration on the leases, right?
Yeah.
And then you have the combination, of course, of a land that is both land for subsurface, exploration of one kind or another, mining or
hmm
drilling,
hmm
and then putting wind turbines on top of it. So you have this really complex system of
Stacked.
rents, essentially.
Yeah. And a Joel Salton farm of energy. Joel
Right.
Salatin farm of energy. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Everything in one place. Right.
No, it's
Thank you.
it's a useful concept and very interesting. And in fact, if only we had socialism, we could push that a little further in terms of hydrogen development. But anyway, that's whatever.
Oh, dream on.
The two things that we need to do are desalination and hydrogen development. But anyway,
Yeah, yeah. There you go. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? I'm planning to stop the live stream because I've gone over time again.